Today, we're going to take a look at one of the most famous images in all of Christianity. But we're going to peel back the layers of tradition and translation and really dig into what the original texts might have been saying all along.
So think about it. We all know these stories, right? They're practically bedrock. But what if a closer look at the Gospels reveals something else? Something that completely challenges that foundational image? Well, that's exactly what we're here to find out. You can just picture it in your head, can't you? It's been in paintings and stained glass windows for centuries. It's a story we've heard since we were kids. A massive, hungry crowd. A couple of loaves of bread, a few fish, and boom, a miracle. It's simple, it's powerful, and it's totally ingrained in our culture. But when you actually go back and read the earliest texts, that simple, clean picture, it starts to get a little messy. So let's start by looking for the first few cracks in these really familiar stories. Okay, check this out, because this is where we start following the breadcrumbs. When Jesus himself talks about this miracle later on, in two different Gospels, he only mentions the bread, not a word about the fish. The earliest Christian writings we have outside of the Gospels, they talk about the miracle meal, but only with bread. Major church thinkers writing about it, you guessed it, just bread. The fish don't even show up in the manuscript record until almost 200 years later. And this slide, this just perfectly shows how stories can, how they can grow in the telling. In Mark, our earliest gospel, the scene is super straightforward. Jesus sees some fishermen, says, "Follow me," and they do. That's it. No big fishing miracle. But then you get to Luke's gospel, written later, and suddenly it's a Hollywood blockbuster. Nets are tearing, boats are literally sinking because they're so full of fish. It's what scholars call legendary development. The classic fisherman's tale, where the fish gets bigger every time you tell the story. And now we get to the real heart of it. A huge piece of this puzzle comes down to translation, and specifically 3 different Greek words that have all been sort of flattened into one simple English word, fish. So first up, you've got this word, prosphagion. This is the word the risen Jesus uses in John 21 when he asks his disciples on the shore if they have any food. In our Bibles, it says fish, but what it really means is much broader. It's just something you eat with bread, a side dish. It could be olives, a dip, some herbs, anything really. Then there's this word, opsarion. In the same story, Jesus is grilling bread and opsarion on a fire. Again, we read it as fish, but originally, this word just meant a savory relish or a side. In fact, if you go way back to Homer's Iliad, it's used to describe a relish made of onions. Over time, it just became associated with fish, kind of like how if I said, "Let's grab a drink," you'd probably think of alcohol, not just a glass of water. The meaning shifted. And finally, ichthys. Now, to be clear, this one does mean fish. It's used for the big, miraculous catch of fish in John 21. But, and this is a huge but, for the early Christians, it was so much more than that. It was a secret code, an acronym for their most central belief. Isus Christos Theos Soter, Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. That simple fish symbol wasn't just a fish, it was a password, a quiet sign of faith when being a Christian was dangerous. So, here's the bottom line. Within the exact same story in John 21, the author uses 3 different words. 2 of them just mean side dish, and the one that does mean fish is absolutely loaded with symbolic meaning. But when we read it in English, all that nuance is just gone. It all just becomes fish. So you might be asking, why would these different words matter so much? Why the ambiguity? Well, to get that, we need to zoom out a bit and look at this powerful but often overlooked idea that runs all the way through the Hebrew Bible. We're going to call it the blue thread. This thread starts right at the beginning, in Genesis 1. God's original ideal diet for humanity? It's completely plant-based. Later, in the wilderness, when the Israelites whine and demand meat, God gives it to them, but it's pretty clear this is a disappointment. Fast forward, and you have the prophets just railing against the whole system of animal sacrifice. By the time we get to Jesus, this tradition is alive and well in key figures around him, including his own brother, James, the leader of the early church in Jerusalem, who was famously a lifelong vegetarian. And this isn't some obscure fringe idea. This is a direct quote from the prophet Hosea, and it's a line that Jesus himself uses over and over again in the Gospels. He is deliberately putting himself in that prophetic tradition, one that values compassion way above ritual bloodshed. Okay, let's talk about the elephant, or I guess the fish, in the room. What about the stories where Jesus very clearly eats fish after he's resurrected? This is the absolute strongest counterargument to everything we've looked at, so we gotta tackle it head on.
So this is where it gets really interesting. These fish-eating scenes, they only show up in Luke and John, and in parts of those Gospels that a lot of scholars think were added later. For instance, John's Gospel seems to have a perfect ending in chapter 20, and then chapter 21 feels kind of tacked on. And linguistic analysis, which is basically using computers to spot an author's unique fingerprint, suggests that the end of Luke was written in a different style than the rest of the book. The theory is these scenes were added to fight back against early ideas that Jesus was just a ghost. What's the best way to prove he's got a real body? Show him eating real food.
So let's go back for a second to that tacked-on chapter, John 21. Remember that miraculous catch? The disciples don't just catch a lot of fish. They catch a very, very specific number, exactly 153. I mean, why? Why that number?
Well, get this. 153 is what's known as a triangular number, and it was sacred to an ancient philosophical school called the Pythagoreans. And what were the Pythagoreans known for? They taught nonviolence, the rejection of animal sacrifice, and, wait for it, vegetarianism. The exact same values as that blue thread we were just following. For this to be a coincidence is, well, it's a stretch. It feels like a very deliberate, symbolic wink to the reader.
So if the fish stories in Luke and John might be later additions, what's the earliest account of a resurrection meal that we know of? Well, the early church fathers talk about a lost text called the Gospel of the Hebrews. In that version, the first person Jesus appears to is his vegetarian brother, James. And what do they eat together? No broiled fish, no honeycomb, just broken bread.
So we've followed the breadcrumbs, we've unpacked the Greek, and we've looked at the history. Let's try to pull all this together and ask the big question. Why does any of this actually matter today?
Because this isn't just some dusty academic debate. The way we interpret these stories has massive, real-world consequences, especially when you think about the scale of fishing in our world. The sources we've been looking at point to the staggering number, the estimated number of fish killed every single year. It's a scale of industrial slaughter that is just light years beyond anything the ancient world could have possibly imagined. So let's just do a quick recap of the investigation. 1. The famous fish stories get really complicated when you look at the earliest texts. 2. The Greek words we translate as fish could have easily meant something else, like a simple side dish. 3. There's this strong, consistent blue thread promoting a plant-based ideal that runs all through the Bible. And 4. The strongest evidence of Jesus eating fish shows up in passages that might have been added later for very specific theological reasons. In the end, this whole thing isn't really about giving you one final, neat answer. It's about showing that the story we think we know is way more complex and honestly, way more fascinating than we usually give it credit for. It makes you want to read more closely, to ask more questions, and to wonder what other foundational stories might be hiding something incredible just beneath the surface.